If I told you that over the last few decades, a specific group of countries managed to increase their primary school enrollment well past 100%.
Which sounds impossible.
Right. Mathematically impossible. And that they added a full 20 years to their average life expectancy, plus they slashed maternal mortality by something like 80%.
Yeah, massive, massive shifts.
If I told you all that, you would probably assume I was talking about, the post-war economic miracles in Europe.
Oh, for sure. Or maybe the rapid industrialization we saw in East Asia back in the late 20th century.
Exactly. But I am not. I mean, I'm talking about the very nations we are conditioned to view almost exclusively through this lens of permanent crisis.
Yeah, it's really the ultimate blind spot in global economics.
It really is.
We have this collective cognitive dissonance when it comes to the developing world. We just totally failed to process monumental progress simply because the baseline starting point was so incredibly difficult.
Right. Well, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are taking a magnifying glass to one of the most comprehensive, misunderstood, and frankly, just astonishing data sets in modern history.
It's a huge one.
Yeah. We have this massive, custom-tailored analysis. It's built on a 15-page academic outline tracking the United Nations and World Bank data sets, and it focuses specifically on the LDCs.
The least developed countries.
Right, the least developed countries. And we are looking at this sweeping historical evolution from the 1970s all the way to the modern day.
Spanning across macroeconomics, human development, social structure, and the environment.
The whole picture.
The whole picture, yeah. And the mission for this deep dive, for you listening right now, is to kind of rip away those charity commercial stereotypes.
Yeah.
We want to look at the hard macroeconomic reality of what it actually takes to build a modern nation from the ground up.
Because the data tells a story that researchers call moving forward firmly in fragility.
Moving forward firmly in fragility. I love that phrase.
It is a phenomenal phrase, isn't it? Firmly in fragility.
Because to understand the triumphs in this data, we first have to really understand the immense structural gravity these nations are fighting against every single day.
So let's establish that baseline. Like, what is an LDC exactly?
Right. So the term least developed country, or LDC, is not just some polite euphemism for poor.
Okay.
It is a highly specific, rigorous classification maintained by the United Nations. And a country only falls into this category if it trips three very distinct alarm bells simultaneously.
And I think this is where a lot of people, including myself, honestly, until I dug into these sources, get it completely wrong.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, we assume it's purely a measure of GDP. If the gross domestic product is below a certain line, boom, you are an LDC.
Right, but it's far more complex than that. Income is only the first pillar.
Okay.
So a low gross national income per capita is required, yes. But the second pillar is a low level of human assets.
Human assets meaning what exactly?
Meaning the UN looks at historical deficits in health, nutrition, and education.
Yeah.
Like you could theoretically have a nation that strikes oil and suddenly has a high income.
Oh, right. The GDP spikes.
Exactly. It spikes.
Mm-hmm.
But if its population is largely illiterate and suffering from systemic malnutrition, it might still struggle with the structural development.
Because the foundation isn't there.
Exactly. And then the third pillar, which is arguably the most crucial for our discussion today, is high economic vulnerability to external shocks.
Vulnerability. So basically a lack of shock absorbers.
Yes.
Like if a hurricane hits or if the global price of their main export collapses, the entire national economy just goes into a tailspin.
Because there is no diversified industrial base to catch the fall. Precisely. It's a structural definition. We aren't just measuring money. We are measuring a nation's foundational capacity to sustain human life and foster economic potential.
In a global system that is inherently pretty hostile to them.
Very hostile. And that is why tracking these specific macroscopic data points, from rural electrical grids to cereal yields to female literacy, gives us the true unvarnished pulse of human progress.
So to you listening right now, whatever assumptions you brought into this deep dive about what life looks like in these nations, be prepared. Because the numbers we are about to explore will fundamentally rewrite them.
They absolutely will.
But we have to start at the absolute bedrock of any economy, right? Because before you can build factories or schools, you have to understand the biological reality of the population itself.
Demographics. It is the prologue to literally any economic destiny.
Yeah.
If you want to know what a nation's geopolitical and economic footprint will be in 20 years, you don't look at its current stock market. You look at its birth rates, its mortality rates, and its population pyramid right now.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the demographic shift in the LDC dataset is our first massive revelation.
It's huge.
Historically, the narrative has always been about explosive, unchecked population growth.
Right, the classic overpopulation panic.
Exactly. And yes, the absolute population size is still expanding. The aggregate data shows this massive upward area chart. But the underlying engine of that growth has fundamentally changed gears.
That's the key.
The data shows that the rate of population growth has actually peaked. It's now firmly on a downward trajectory.
Right.
We are seeing the growth rate slowly walk down from a historical high of roughly 2.61%, progressively dropping to about 2.3% in recent years.
Which I know doesn't sound like a massive drop to a layperson.
Just a few decimal points.
Yeah. But in macroeconomic terms, that deceleration is the equivalent of a tectonic plate shifting.
Wow.
It triggers this profound structural metamorphosis in the population, which we call the demographic dividend.
Okay, I want to pause on that term, demographic dividend. It gets thrown around in academic papers constantly, but the mechanical reality of it is just fascinating to me.
It really is.
It's fundamentally about the math of dependents versus producers, right?
Yeah, exactly. Every population on Earth is divided into three buckets. You have children, working-age adults, and the elderly.
Okay.
The children and the elderly are economic dependents. They require vast amounts of resources, healthcare, housing, schooling, pensions, but they are not actively producing economic output or paying income taxes.
Right, they are consuming.
Yes. The working-age adults are the engine. They generate the wealth.
And the metric that tracks this balance is the age dependency ratio. Basically, how many dependents is every working-age adult carrying on their back, metaphorically speaking?
Yeah. And in the LDC dataset, going back a few decades, that age dependency ratio was an incredibly heavy 83.4%.
83.4. So meaning for every 100 working-age adults, there were over 83 dependents relying entirely on them.
Yes. It's a crushing burden.
I try to visualize this at the household level to really grasp the friction it causes.
Yeah.
You know, imagine a household with 2 working adults. If they are supporting, say, 6 children and 2 aging grandparents, the entire wealth potential of those 2 workers is instantly evaporated just by basic survival.
Instantly. It's gone.
Every dollar goes to rice, to school uniforms, to basic medicine. There is literally nothing left at the end of the month to put in a savings account, let alone, invest in a business or upgrade their home.
And if you scale that household up to an entire country, you have a national economy that is functionally trapped.
Wow, trapped.
Yeah, it cannot accumulate capital because it is forced to consume absolutely everything it produces just to keep its population alive.
That makes total sense. And I guess that explains why that drop from 2.61 to 2.3% is so revolutionary.
Exactly. Because as birth rates slowly begin to fall, which is often due to early interventions in health and education, which we will get into later,
Right.
the base of the population pyramid begins to narrow.
Right.
Meanwhile, those millions of children who were born during the high-growth years, they grow up and enter the workforce.
And suddenly the ratio flips. The age dependency ratio in these nations has steadily dropped from that heavy 83.4% down to 75.2%.
The kids grew up, got jobs, and crucially, they aren't having as many children themselves.
Right. So the country suddenly finds itself with this massive bulge of working-age adults and relatively fewer dependents. That is the demographic dividend.
It is an economic coiled spring. Those 2 workers, in your analogy, they now only have 2 children to support instead of 6.
Oh, I see. So suddenly they have surplus income.
Exactly. They have surplus, they open a bank account, the bank loans that money to a local business, the business builds a factory.
It's the whole cycle of capital accumulation.
Yes, it represents an unprecedented, once-in-a-history window for rapid economic growth, national savings, and infrastructure investment.
But, and this is a big but, the data also acts as a warning here, doesn't it? A demographic dividend is not an automatic guarantee of prosperity.
No, definitely not.
Like a massive youth bulge is only an economic engine if those young people actually have something to do.
Right. An unemployed, frustrated youth bulge is not a dividend at all. It's a destabilizing force.
Yeah. If that coiled spring releases and there is no machinery to capture the kinetic energy, it doesn't build an economy. It just shatters the social order.
Which brings us to the fundamental prerequisite for capturing that energy. If you have, 50 million young people entering the workforce over a decade, they need tools.
Right.
They need factories to manufacture goods. They need internet cafes to participate in the digital economy. They need automated agricultural equipment.
And none of that exists without one defining technology. Which brings us to infrastructure.
Electricity.
Electricity. This is where the dataset tells a story of incredible triumph, followed almost immediately by a terrifying reality check regarding inequality.
Yeah, the contrast is stark.
Let's look at the aggregate data first. Total electricity access across the least developed countries skyrocketed.
Yeah.
We are talking about jumping from a historical baseline where only 20.2% of the population had access.
Just 1 in 5 people.
Right, 1 in 5. And it went all the way up to 58.4%.
That is hundreds of millions of human beings turning on a light switch for the very first time.
Yeah.
I mean, think about the impact.
It's staggering.
It's the advent of refrigeration for food and vaccines. It's the ability for children to study after sundown, the birth of light manufacturing in these areas.
Right. And if you just look at that total 58.4%, the instinct is to celebrate. Like, great. They are well past the halfway mark.
But you can't just look at the aggregate average.
Exactly. The beauty of this granular 15-page data outline we have is that it prevents us from being seduced by those aggregate numbers. When you peel back that 58.4%, the structural chasm it reveals is truly shocking.
It's what we call the dumbbell effect.
The dumbbell effect. Because the data does not describe a uniform blanket of progress spreading evenly across these nations, right? It describes severe, violent concentration.
The urban-rural divide.
Let's hit the numbers on that. Urban electricity access in these LDCs has reached an incredibly impressive 82.8%.
Over 4/5.
Right. The cities are lighting up, they are plugging into the global grid, building modern skylines, integrating into international supply chains. But the rural access,
That's where it gets grim.
it started at a historical low of just 11.3%.
Barely 1 in 10 people outside the urban centers had power.
And despite decades of national development plans, the rural grid has violently struggled to catch up. It's only reaching roughly 45.8% today.
It really forces us to ask what happens to the psychological and social fabric of a nation when such a severe duality exists.
Like, you have a house where the living room is a smart home and the bedrooms are lit by candles.
That's a great way to put it. You have a capital city with high-speed internet, automated manufacturing, 24-hour illuminated hospitals. But just a 3-hour bus ride away, the countryside is still literally in the dark.
Relying on diesel generators if they are lucky.
Right, or kerosene lamps and firewood if they aren't.
I just struggle to even conceptualize the political tension that must create. If I'm a 20-year-old living in that rural area, and I know that just a few hundred miles away, there is a city with an 82.8% grid access rate.
Where you could charge a phone, get a job in a lit building let.
Escape subsistence farming. I mean, I am not staying in my village.
And they don't. The data shows exactly how populations react to this dumbbell effect. It drives rapid, often chaotic urbanization.
They just pack up and leave.
Yeah. The demographic dividend, those millions of young, working-age people, they migrate to the urban centers in staggering numbers. The resources follow the people, and the people follow the grid.
Which concentrates the wealth and political capital in the cities.
Exactly, which then leaves the rural areas even further behind, creating this compounding cycle of neglect.
Which naturally leads to the most dangerous bottleneck in the entire development process. And this is the macroeconomy section of the data.
Right.
If the youth are draining out of the agricultural heartlands, and the population overall is still expanding, and the cities are swelling with millions of new residents who do not farm,
how do you feed everyone?
exactly. You can't eat electricity.
That is the existential puzzle of structural transformation.
Yeah.
And the macro data on agriculture provides an answer that is highly counterintuitive.
Here is where it gets really interesting. Let's look at the numbers. When we look at agriculture, forestry, and fishing as a percentage of gross domestic product in these LDCs, the line on the graph takes a steep dive.
Right. It drops from contributing over 36.4% of the total GDP down to under 19.8%.
Now, if a politician or a casual observer looks at that chart, seeing the agricultural sector's share of the economy basically get sliced in half, they might panic.
Oh, they do. It looks like an agricultural collapse.
Right. It looks like the farms are dying while the cities gorge themselves.
But the absolute opposite is true, and this is why we have to separate relative percentages from absolute physical reality.
Okay, break that down for us.
While agriculture shrank as a percentage of the economy, the absolute value of agricultural production in these nations actually tripled.
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 Yeah.
We are talking about jumping from $91.1 billion to over $250.7 billion in constant U.S. dollars.
Wow. 250 billion.
This is a textbook, beautiful example of structural transformation. It is the core indicator that a developing economy is actually becoming healthier.
So the agricultural sector didn't shrink at all.
No, it grew massively.
Yeah.
But the manufacturing and service sectors in those newly electrified cities grew so much faster that agriculture's relative slice of the total economic pie became smaller.
I see. It's a math trick. A slice of pie getting smaller only because the pie itself got massive.
Exactly.
Let's talk about the overall GDP for a second, because the data on that is wild. The absolute GDP, calculated in constant local currency, skyrocketed from around 2.39 trillion up to 12.96 trillion.
Yes, a massive leap in sheer economic volume.
But the volatility, the data points out that while they hit high growth rates, sometimes maintaining between 4 and 7.5%, they also suffered these massive plunges.
Right, dropping below 1% or even going into negative growth due to external shocks.
Which just highlights that fragility. But going back to the farms here, is the physical problem with jumping from $91 billion to $250 billion in agricultural value.
You can't just print new land.
You literally can't. The data set tracks land use, and there simply isn't enough newly cleared arable land to account for a tripling of total value.
No, there isn't. The secret is revealed in a completely different metric, which is the cereal yield per hectare.
And this might be one of the most vital statistics in the entire deep dive.
It's the linchpin of the whole transition.
The cereal yield literally doubled. It went from 1,072 kilograms per hectare all the way to over 2,130 kilograms.
We really need to pause and respect the sheer monumental scale of that human achievement.
It's mind-blowing.
Put yourself in the dirt for a moment. Imagine you are a rural farmer. You have 1 hectare of land, a physical space roughly the size of an international rugby pitch.
Okay.
For generations, your father and his father pulled maybe 1,000 kilograms of grain from that exact patch of earth.
Right.
That 1,000 kilos has to feed your family for the year, and if the rains were perfect, maybe you had a tiny surplus to barter. Fast forward a few decades. That exact same physical geography is now yielding over 2,100 kilograms.
On the exact same dirt.
From the exact same dirt. It defies the historical limits of human muscle and soil exhaustion.
But how does that actually happen mechanically? Because we just established that rural electricity is still lacking terribly at 45.8%.
Right, they don't have power.
It's not like every farm in these LDCs suddenly got hooked up to a computerized, electrically pumped precision irrigation system.
No, they didn't. What we are seeing here is the deployment of industrial chemistry and combustion.
Okay, chemistry.
The data set tracks agricultural inputs, and we see corresponding massive spikes in chemical fertilizer consumption. We see the introduction of higher yield, drought-resistant crop varieties.
Well, like a green revolution tech.
Exactly. And we see basic mechanization tractors and tillers powered by diesel fuel, which doesn't require an electric grid rather than electric machinery.
Right. You just need a gas can.
Yeah. This doubling of yield is the primary engine that allows urbanization to happen without mass starvation. If one farmer can suddenly feed twice as many people using diesel and nitrogen fertilizer, it literally frees up another human being's labor to move to the city and work at a textile mill.
It's incredible. But the reliance on imported chemistry and diesel fuel creates a terrifying vulnerability, right?
Oh, massively.
We noted earlier that an LDC is defined by its high economic vulnerability to external shocks, the GDP volatility you talked about. And that agricultural miracle is deeply implicated in that vulnerability. Because if your entire strategy for feeding your urban centers relies on specialized seeds and heavy chemical fertilizer inputs, you are now completely tethered to global commodity markets.
You are at their mercy. If the global price of natural gas spikes, the cost of manufacturing nitrogen fertilizer skyrockets.
And suddenly your farmers can't afford the inputs.
Exactly. The 2,100 kilogram yield drops back down to 1,500. Food inflation hits the cities, and your 7.5% GDP growth turns into a recession overnight.
Not to mention the climate shock aspect. If you are relying on chemical fertilizer to boost yield, but you don't have the electrical grid to run deep well irrigation systems, you are still entirely at the mercy of the rain.
Yes, a single severe drought cycle can wipe out the macroeconomic gains of an entire decade.
Which forces us to ask about the technological hardstop of this current model. If rural areas remain stranded at that 45% electricity access rate, how much further can agricultural productivity actually go?
That's the billion-dollar question. Can they hit 3,000 kilograms per hectare? Probably not.
Right, there's a ceiling.
They were approaching the ceiling of what diesel engines and chemical fertilizers can achieve without the precision, efficiency, and irrigation security of a fully electrified rural infrastructure.
That is a brilliant point. You can only squeeze so much efficiency out of a 19th century infrastructure model using 20th century chemicals.
Eventually, you need 21st century power grids.
But building those grids requires massive capital. And when we look at the financial data in this, specifically slide 6 of the outline, we uncover a dynamic that is actively draining that capital away.
The sovereign debt burden.
Yeah.
This is where the macroeconomic reality becomes quite grim.
I was absolutely floored by this specific data point. The dataset tracks public and publicly guaranteed external debt service as a percentage of export earnings.
Right.
And at its peak, this number hit an astonishing 29.3%.
We really need to unpack the mechanics of that because debt service sounds like a benign accounting term, but for a developing nation, it is an economic hemorrhage.
Let me make sure I understand the mechanism here. 29.3% of export earnings. That means for every $10 this country makes selling its goods to the global market, whether that's selling copper or textiles or agricultural surplus, almost 3 of those dollars instantly leave the country.
They never even touch the domestic economy.
They go straight to foreign creditors in New York, London, or Beijing just to pay the interest and principal on old loans.
That is exactly right. And the crucial element here is the word external. Developing nations generally cannot borrow money on the international markets in their own local currency.
Because investors consider their currencies too volatile.
Exactly. So they have to borrow in US dollars or euros. This creates a terrifying dynamic. If an LDC's local currency depreciates against the dollar, maybe because of a global shock entirely outside their control, the actual burden of their debt essentially multiplies.
Even if they didn't borrow a single cent more.
Right.
They have to print more and more of their own currency just to buy the dollars needed to pay the interest.
Yes. It just drains their foreign exchange reserves. And remember, that capital, we said, was needed to build out the rural electrical grid.
Or to buy the imported fertilizer.
Exactly. That capital is being exported to service debt. That 29.3% peak ratio is a massive anchor dragging on their structural transformation. It represents roads not paved, hospitals not built, and power lines not strung.
It paints a picture of a nation sprinting on a treadmill just to avoid falling backwards.
It's exhausting.
But despite this massive financial anchor, these countries are still pushing forward in the one area they know will eventually break the cycle, and that's their own people.
Yes, the human capital.
The human capital data in this UN set is, without a doubt, the most inspiring yet structurally complex segment we're going to look at today.
Because if the food supply is relatively secure for now, and the cities are electrifying, the rules of economic survival for the next generation have permanently changed.
Physical labor is no longer enough.
No. To work in the newly diversified urban sectors, the youth need something their grandparents simply didn't possess.
Education. We are looking at the silent revolution of the school system. And the numbers here, honestly, they actually broke my brain for a second when I first read them.
They are wild numbers.
Let's look at the gross enrollment ratio for primary education. The outline shows the primary gross enrollment rate climbing from a historical baseline of roughly 51.4% up to an astonishing 100.6%. And some specific intake metrics even hit 117%.
Let's address the mathematical anomaly right away, because seeing an enrollment percentage over 100% usually makes people assume the data is corrupted.
I certainly did.
Okay.
I stared at the spreadsheet thinking, wait, how do you have over 100% of kids enrolled? Did they invent new children?
It's a vital statistical quirk to understand. Gross enrollment, or gross intake, compares the total number of children entering first grade, regardless of their actual age, against the total population of children who are the official age for first grade.
Ah, okay. Let's walk through a hypothetical to make that concrete.
Suppose the official age for starting first grade in a given country is 6 years old.
Okay.
If the country has 1 million 6-year-olds in its population, and exactly 1 million 6-year-olds enroll in school, your gross intake is a perfect 100%.
Right, simple math.
But what happens in a country that has suffered decades of educational poverty, and then suddenly the government builds thousands of new schools, drops prohibitive tuition fees, and launches a massive national education campaign?
Oh, the dam breaks. The 1 million 6-year-olds show up, but so do the 8-year-olds and the 10-year-olds and the 12-year-olds who never had the chance to go to school before.
Precisely. An intake ratio of over 100% represents a system that is flooded.
It's catching up.
Yes. It is the statistical footprint of a society expanding its educational capacity at a breakneck pace. It represents a massive backlog of human potential rushing through newly opened doors.
And the most profound shift inside that rush is who is walking through those doors. This brings us to slide 8, the Gender Parity Index, or GPI.
This is a huge one.
This metric measures the ratio of female to male enrollment. A score of 1.0 means perfect, absolute equality. Historically, the GPI for primary school enrollment in these LDCs was 0.61.
That is evidence of heavy systemic inequality. It means for every 100 boys getting a basic education, only 61 girls were allowed to attend.
So the other 39 girls were kept home.
Kept home to do domestic labor, put to work in the fields, or married off at a young age.
But the dataset shows that GPI rocketing from 0.61 up to 0.95, near total statistical equality.
It's incredible.
Imagine the cultural earthquake required to achieve that. Going from a society where barely half the girls are deemed worthy of schooling to one where nearly every single girl is sitting at a desk alongside her brothers. And that happens in the span of a single generation.
It is arguably the most powerful economic lever a developing nation can pull. The data is unequivocal on this. Achieving a 0.95 GPI isn't just a victory for human rights or social justice,
Right.
It is cold, hard economics. Educating a young woman is historically proven to be the single most effective intervention to lower infant mortality, raise household income, and stabilize a developing economy.
And we see the downstream effects of that primary school surge in the youth literacy data, right on slide 9. The youth literacy rate measuring ages 15 to 24 saw its gender parity index climb from 0.68 up to 0.95 as well.
Yes, the literacy gap closed.
We are looking at absolute growth in youth female literacy, jumping from 29.2% up to 62.2%. That is a massive 33% absolute increase in young women who can read, write, and participate in a formal economy.
And the health outcomes that follow that specific literacy spike are miraculous, because health and education are inextricably linked.
Let's transition into that health data, because this is where the human impact is just most visceral. Look at slide 10. The dataset shows the total population's life expectancy at birth jumping from a historical low of roughly 41.1 years to over 64.6 years, and women reaching 66.2 years.
They literally added over 2 decades to the average human lifespan.
20 extra years of life, on average, for every citizen born today compared to their grandparents.
It's profound.
And the maternal health data is even more staggering. The lifetime risk of maternal death plummeted. It went from a terrifying 6.8% down to roughly 1.2%. That is an 80% reduction in maternal mortality risk.
Yeah. We need to explain what a 6.8% lifetime risk actually means, because it sounds relatively low until you actually do the math.
Yeah, please do.
A nearly 7% lifetime risk means that if a woman goes through her reproductive years, she has roughly a 1 in 15 chance of dying from pregnancy-related causes. If she has 5 or 6 children, which was common before the demographic shifts we discussed earlier, she is rolling the dice with her life over and over again.
Wow.
Dropping that risk by 80% completely alters the psychological and social reality of motherhood.
But I want to push back on the causality here, or at least expand it. How did they achieve an 80% drop? It can't just be because women learned how to read. I mean, literacy is great, but reading a book doesn't stop a postpartum hemorrhage.
You are absolutely right to demand the mechanism there. Literacy is the catalyst, but infrastructure is the vehicle.
Okay, unpack that.
A mother who can read is vastly more likely to understand sanitation practices. She is more likely to space her pregnancies using family planning, which physically allows her body to recover. But crucially, she is more empowered to interact with the modern healthcare system.
I see.
That 80% drop represents the building of rural clinics, the training of professional midwives to replace untrained traditional birth attendants, and the deployment of basic antibiotics.
It also ties back to the electrical grid and the roads, right? If there's an emergency during labor, you need a mobile phone network to call a clinic, a paved road for an ambulance or a taxi to drive on, and a clinic that actually has electricity to run an operating room or keep oxytocin refrigerated.
Exactly. Every data point is connected.
Hmm.
We also see this in the infectious disease burden on slide 12. The incidence rate for tuberculosis fell from 266 per 100,000 people down to the 190s.
Which is a solid improvement, though we have to be intellectually honest and note that the absolute base of disease remains a core health threat. Dropping to the 190s is progress, but it still means TB and other communicable diseases like malaria are massive structural burdens compared to the developed world.
The trajectory is undeniably positive, but the fragility remains. And that fragility is actually mirrored in the education sector as well.
Yes, let's go back to education for a second, because the retention data is sobering.
Right, because while getting the kids in the door is a solved problem with that 100% enrollment, keeping them there and ensuring they actually learn is a completely different story.
This is the hidden vulnerability of the human capital boom. The entry level is a triumph, but the retention rate reveals immense system strain. The data set tracks the primary school repetition rate, the percentage of students who fail to meet the academic standard and are held back a grade.
Yeah.
Across this entire historical timeline of booming enrollment, that repetition rate has stubbornly lingered between 10% and 17%.
Meaning that at any given time, 1 in 10, and sometimes nearly 1 in 5 children, is failing to progress through the system.
What does that tell us about the reality inside those classrooms?
It tells us about a massive collapse in system efficiency. You flood the schools with children, which, again, is the right thing to do.
Of course.
But if your debt burden is preventing you from hiring enough trained teachers, and you have a classroom where the ratio is 80 students to 1 instructor, learning breaks down.
And furthermore, remember that gross enrollment included 6-year-olds and 12-year-olds in the exact same room.
Yes, the pedagogical challenge is impossible. The kids are physically in the building, but the quality of education is severely diluted.
The system is leaking. They built a massive pipeline to capture the demographic dividend. They pumped it full of students, but there are holes everywhere.
And the ultimate risk is that these students eventually graduate or drop out, and they enter the labor market without the high-level cognitive skills necessary to participate in the formal, diversified economy.
Right, they can read, which is a massive leap forward, but they might not have the math or technical skills to operate industrial machinery or work in a modern service sector.
Which bridges us perfectly into the reality of the labor market in these least developed countries. Slide 13 covers this.
Let's look at it. We have a booming urbanizing population. They are living 20 years longer, they are better fed by that doubled cereal yield, and they are closer to gender parity than ever before. But when they walk out of the schoolhouse and look for a job, what do they actually find?
The data here is stark. It forces us to confront the difference between having a job and having a livelihood.
Yeah.
Despite all the macroeconomic GDP growth we discussed, the proportion of what the UN calls vulnerable employment has barely budged.
Let's define vulnerable employment because it makes up the vast majority of the daily reality for people in these nations. The dataset shows it dropping slightly from a historical high of 70.3% down to about 66.2%.
So it's still around 2/3 of the workforce. Vulnerable employment encompasses 2 specific categories: unpaid family workers and own account workers.
Own account worker. That sounds like a fancy term for an entrepreneur or a freelancer.
In a wealthy nation, maybe. In an LDC, an own account worker is typically someone operating in the informal, street-level economy.
Ah, I see.
It's the woman selling fruit by the side of the road. It's the young man who bought a used motorcycle to run an informal taxi service. They are self-employed out of absolute necessity, not out of entrepreneurial ambition.
So we are talking about over 2/3 of the entire labor force operating without a formal paycheck. No legal employment contract, no sick leave, no pension contributions.
And absolutely no social safety net.
They are entirely exposed to the economic shocks that define the LDC classification.
Completely exposed. If the motorcycle taxi driver gets sick and cannot drive for a week, he earns 0 income. If a severe storm wipes out the fruit vendor's stall, she has no insurance to rebuild.
The formal salaried sector, the jobs with desks, safety regulations, and predictable incomes, is still incredibly narrow.
It's a terrifying tightrope. You have millions of young people who have migrated to the cities, living in rapidly expanding urban centers, working in an informal economy where a single bad week means not eating.
And speaking of severe storms wiping out stalls, we have to look at the environmental toll of this entire development process.
Slide 14, the environmental pressures.
Because building this new society, electrifying the cities, and tripling agricultural output requires massive amounts of physical energy and resource extraction. And the environmental ledger in this data set is deeply, deeply concerning.
It is the ultimate double-edged sword of industrialization. Every nation that has ever modernized has had to pass through this crucible. But the LDCs are doing it under conditions that are far more hostile than what Europe or America faced a century ago.
Let's look at two specific contrasting data points that perfectly illustrate this tension. I want to look at particulate emission damage and then look at macro carbon dioxide emissions because they tell two totally different stories about health and environment.
Okay, let's start with particulate emission damage. This metric tracks the health and economic damage caused by humans breathing in tiny toxic particles, usually from smoke.
Right. And in the LDCs, particulate emission damage as a percentage of gross national income has actually dropped significantly. It went from over 5.1% down to 1.09%.
And we should clarify for the listener why the dataset switches to gross national income, or GNI, here, rather than the GDP we were discussing earlier.
Yeah, what's the difference?
So GDP measures all the economic value produced inside the country's borders, even if a foreign corporation owns the factory and takes the profits out. GNI measures the income actually retained by the citizens of the country, plus remittances sent home from workers abroad. When you are measuring the direct economic damage of health issues on a population, GNI is often a more accurate reflection of the national wallet.
That makes total sense. So the economic damage to the citizens from breathing in toxic smoke has plummeted. Why?
That drop is a direct, beautiful reflection of the electrification data we discussed at the very beginning. When a rural village or a new urban slum gets access to the grid, the very first thing that changes is how they cook and heat their homes.
They stop burning firewood, charcoal, or dried animal dung inside enclosed spaces.
Exactly, which historically meant women and children were spending hours every day trapped in a hut filled with thick, blinding smoke, leading to massive rates of respiratory illness.
So the air inside the home gets drastically cleaner the moment they plug in a cheap electric hot plate. The localized particulate pollution drops.
It's a huge win for local health.
But then we look at the macro atmosphere. The air inside the house is clean, but what is happening outside? Carbon dioxide damage as a percentage of GNI has nearly tripled, moving from 0.49% to over 1.4%.
And absolute emissions reflect that.
Right. The absolute CO2 emissions, excluding land use changes, have skyrocketed. We are looking at a jump from a baseline of roughly 47.3 megatons up to over 107 megatons. The absolute carbon output has more than doubled.
This is the tragic carbon trade-off. The indoor air is cleaner because they plugged in an electric stove. But the grid powering that stove is almost certainly burning coal, heavy fuel oil, or natural gas.
The broader economy is now burning fossil fuels at a rapid rate to power the urban centers, to run the manufacturing plants, and to fuel the thousands of diesel tractors and trucks transporting that doubled cereal yield from the farms to the cities.
It's a cruel irony. The LDCs are generating vastly more carbon precisely to pull themselves out of poverty. They are following the exact same industrial playbook the wealthy nations use to build their middle classes.
But the timing is terrible.
Exactly. Yet, because of their geographic locations and their lack of infrastructural resilience, they are the ones who will suffer the most from a warming planet.
This is the core concept of climate vulnerability. Let's compare two scenarios. When a wealthy nation experiences a severe climate shock, say a superstorm or a prolonged multi-year drought, they have deep financial shock absorbers.
They have federally backed crop insurance, massive emergency management agencies,
and a population where the vast majority of people work indoors in formal salary jobs that aren't instantly destroyed by the weather.
But in an LDC, where 66% of the workforce is in vulnerable informal employment and the rural electrical grid is patchy at best, a climate shock is an apocalyptic event.
Right. If a superstorm hits, the street vendors lose everything. The farmers utilizing high-yield seeds without electric irrigation lose their entire crop. The roads wash out, meaning the pregnant women can't get to the newly built clinics.
A single climate event can wipe out decades of that hard-won GDP growth overnight.
And it isn't just carbon emissions that threaten their long-term stability. To finance this massive build-out to try and outrun the demographics and build the cities, we see natural resource depletion swinging wildly.
They're cashing out their environment.
Yeah. The dataset shows resource depletion consuming up to 14.6% of gross national income at its peak, while net forest depletion consistently hovers between 3% and 7% year over year.
They are cutting down their forests and aggressively mining raw materials to finance their development.
Liquidating their natural capital to pay for physical and human capital.
And a large portion of the revenue generated from liquidating those forests and mines isn't even staying in the country.
Because of the debt.
Right back to the sovereign debt burden we discussed.
Yeah.
They are cutting down trees to pay the 29.3% debt service to foreign creditors.
So we have to look at the global geopolitical system here. The wealthy world, the international institutions, they are constantly lecturing developing nations to, leapfrog fossil fuels, to build a 21st century green, sustainable economy.
But how can they possibly afford to transition to green energy when their fundamental economic survival and their ability to service international debt is completely tethered to carbon-heavy industrialization and resource extraction?
It is an impossible bind. The global financial system demands immediate hard currency returns on debt, which usually requires exploiting traditional resources. But the global climate consensus demands they stop exploiting those resources.
They are handed a mandate to build a futuristic green economy, but they are handed a 19th century bill to pay for it.
Which brings us to the ultimate crossroads for the least developed countries. We've hit slide 15, the conclusion. We have analyzed millions of data points spanning decades. We have seen the math of human progress and the heavy anchors of systemic risk.
We need to synthesize this.
Let's construct a mental balance scale for you, the listener. Let's weigh the undeniable triumphs we've discovered in the data against the structural risks that threaten to completely unravel them.
Okay, on the left side of the scale, the achievements are historic. We have the demographic dividend, the slowing of population growth resulting in a massive, youthful, and potentially highly productive workforce.
We have an agricultural sector that defied the limits of the soil, doubling its cereal yield and tripling its absolute value, preventing mass starvation during a period of rapid urbanization.
We have a silent revolution in human capital, a primary school enrollment ratio that smashed past 100% to catch up on lost generations, achieving absolute gender parity in the classroom.
And a 33% spike in youth female literacy. We have a public health miracle, 20 years added to the average human lifespan, and an 80% reduction in maternal mortality risk.
These are not statistical rounding errors. They are massive victories for human dignity.
But on the right side of the scale, the heavy structural risks weigh down the future. We have a torn dumbbell infrastructure where 82% of the city is lit, but over half the countryside remains in the dark, driving desperate urbanization.
We have an education system leaking efficiency, with repetition rates hovering near 17%.
We have a terrifyingly fragile labor market, where over 2/3 of the workforce operates in vulnerable, informal employment with no safety net.
We have a reliance on carbon emissions and natural resource depletion that makes them acutely vulnerable to climate shocks.
And looming over all of it is a crushing external debt burden that siphons off the exact capital needed to fix these problems.
The future for LDCs relies entirely on a kind of macroeconomic alchemy. The great test of the next 20 years is whether these nations can take this newfound human capital, their increasingly educated, healthy, and youthful populations, and convert it into high-value, formal economic productivity before the environmental, structural, and financial debts come due.
Can they build a resilient, formal middle class before the climate shocks overwhelm their fragile grids and informal markets?
It is a race against time. And it brings us back to where we started. When you look at the nations labeled as least developed, you are not looking at a static picture of poverty.
You are looking at a society moving forward firmly in fragility. They are attempting the most difficult maneuver in global economics. They are building the airplane while actively flying it through a hurricane.
It is, without exaggeration, the most vital, high-stakes economic drama happening on the planet today.
As these countries finally build the infrastructure, double their yields, and educate their workforce to leave the LDC list behind, I want to leave you with one lingering thought not directly answered by the dataset.
Let's hear it.
The data shows they are learning how to play the game of industrial development. But as they rise, is the global economic order actually ready to make room for them at the top table? Or will the wealthy nations change the rules of the global economic game just as these countries finally learn how to play it?
That is the defining geopolitical question of the coming century.
Keep questioning the numbers and always look for the human mechanism beneath the data. Because behind every percentage point, every fluctuation in GDP or carbon output, there is a girl opening a book for the first time, a farmer looking at the sky praying for rain, and a nation trying to build a solid future out of fragile ground. We'll catch you next time on the Deep Dive.